Imagine you are an ant, and you have never before seen a human. Then, one day, into your colony, a huge fingernail is thrust, scraping and digging. You flee to another entrance, only to be confronted by a staring eye gazing at you. You climb to the top, trying to find escape, and above you can see the vast, dark shadow of a boot falling upon you. Would that ant be able to construct these things into the form of a single human being? Or would it believe itself to be under attack by three different, equally terrible, but very distinct assailants?
Hi, my name is Dan Crabmeat. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the world is constantly falling apart, and we have no choice but to pick up the pieces like ants trying to get to their destination, just scrambling around them. And so that we don't lose our entire minds in the interim, a lot of us do this thing where we consume media as a way of lightening up the tone in our little rooms. That's evidently what I call our heads. Something I've been doing, instead of lightening up the mood, is I've been making it significantly worse inside my head these past few months. How have you been doing that, Dan? Thanks for asking. So I got really into this podcast called the Magnus Archives. Some of you have probably heard of it, some of you definitely listened to it all the way through, been a fan since the beginning. I have to admit, I got here pretty late. They were well into season 5 by the time I showed up, which gave me the distinct pleasure of just listening to 170 some odd episodes of this horror podcast while I was moving, actually, by myself into this new apartment, alone. So, now, why this specific media? Like, why has it been stuck in your head, Dan? You're a really good friend, and I like that you ask me questions. So, this podcast is essentially a really interesting horror anthology series, or it was meant to start out that way anyways. The head writer, Jonathan Sims, proposed this idea to his buddy, Alexander J. Newell, head of Rusty Quill, suggested that they start an anthology series where Jonathan Sims, playing himself, would serve as this sort of storyteller. He'd be like, "Oh, welcome, children. Here's a horror story. Go be scared now." After sort of messing around with this idea for a while, they decided that they would also have a story connecting all of the individual scary stories to one another through this really expansive, really complicated meta plot. I am hoping that you have already listened to the podcast, but in the interest of keeping this video accessible, let me quickly explain the plot and episode structure that Rusty Quill has implemented in telling this story. So there's this institute. It's called the Magnus Institute. It's in London, and it archives a lot of spooky stories. They call themselves a paranormal research facility. At this place, there once was a woman named Gertrude Robinson. She was the head archivist of the Magnus Institute, responsible for sorting out scary stories and doing other things. Unfortunately, she died in the line of duty doing her archiving job, thus leaving a vacant position for our boy, Jonathan Sims, to fill. I should note here that this is not the creator doing a self-insert. This is a separate character that just bears his name because that is not confusing. Needless to say, this is a great day to be Jonathan Sims. Now, to briefly explain the episode structure of each episode. So it begins with about 2 to 5 minutes of Jonathan Sims giving a little summary of what he's about to read, and then complaining about his life and or job. Then we get into the statements, and the statements structure is roughly as follows. Hello, Archivist. I'm a relatively normal person. Let me tell you a little bit about my typical life. My typical life was interrupted when I encountered something spooky or beyond what I thought was possible. This can vary wildly from spiders to things jumping out of graves, zombies, monsters, all kinds of... Use your imagination. Yep, that definitely happened in this podcast. Now, after this thing, you might think that maybe things went back to normal. Unfortunately, things did not go back to normal. Things got drastically worse. They got so bad that I couldn't really deal with it in my life, couldn't really talk to anybody in my life about it without being laughed out of the room due to the supernatural and or paranormal and or unexplainable nature of the phenomenon. And, well, you see, that is why I am here, giving my statement to you, Jonathan Sims, and or Gertrude Robinson, and then at the end of it, we verify whether it's true or not by asking the assistants to run some errands, and then we get an itty-bitty little confirmation that tells us something about the world. Nothing too committal, nothing too clarifying, definitely something unsettling. And then rinse and repeat, and basically that's the Magnus Archives. This is a piece of media that is deeply concerned with fears and fear. fears as in specific phobias and their specific manifestations, as well as fear in general as a part of the human experience and a concept. Now, this isn't really a new thing for horror to try to explore, but it's still extremely hard to do well. That being said, I genuinely think that this podcast, by merit of its constraints, its structure, the well-paced meta-plot, and the thoughtful attention of its writers, is able to be a really thoughtful deconstruction of the way that we as humans systematize our responses to fear, consciously and unconsciously. Now, what do I mean when I say constraints? Well, I mean a few things by that. The first layer of this is that every artistic medium has its own built-in constraints. Take, for instance, the Magnus Archive. This exists in the form of a podcast, meaning that it exists entirely in audio. This means that any visuals, any other sensations that they hope to achieve, they must do so through the framework of audio. In addition to the constraints of the medium, there's constraints to the formatting of the medium. So Jonathan Sims and company knew that they were going to be releasing this at a certain time. They were going to have 5 seasons with 40 episodes per season, and each episode would be about 20 minutes. So there are the constraints built into this format as well. There's also knew that they wanted each episode to contain within itself one unique, complete short story. My favorite constraint that they have introduced in addition to this is the fact that each of the tapes is actually diegetic. And what this means is that there has to be an in-universe, in-story reason for us as the audience to be hearing what we're hearing. This is someone within the action deciding to whip out a tape recorder. We are not third-person omniscient, we are ourselves a character within the story. It means that before anything can happen, we have to hear an explanation from the narrative as to why the tapes are present. And the reason given is pretty smart. In this institute where they collect scary stories, some of the scary stories resist being recorded through digital means. They seemingly demand to be recorded in this analog mode. The Arc of the Archivist. Season 1 features John simply reading a statement a week, and then sending his archival assistants, Tim, Sasha, and Martin, to follow up on specific details. Although there are plenty of instances where we get other narrators, or even statements directly from witnesses, it is undeniable that the podcast follows its main narrator, the archivist. From here on, when I say Jonathan Sims, please assume that I mean the character unless I state otherwise. John begins his journey possessed by this obnoxious skepticism. He doubts the authenticity of most of the statements, and often makes fun of them. He continues this attitude for most of the first season, even after he gets undeniable proof that there is something genuinely supernatural going on. This is something that frustrates his assistants, especially Martin, who calls him out on it. John's response is something that recontextualizes his previous attitude.
Because I'm scared, Martin. Because when I record these statements, it feels like I'm being watched. I lose myself a bit, and then when I come back, it's like if I admit there may be any truth to it, whatever's watching will know somehow. The skepticism, feigning ignorance, it just felt safer.
This conversation takes place very near the end of Season 1, from which point on the archivist and his colleagues have entirely no excuse for feigning ignorance, as they are under constant threat by some new, yet unknown supernatural force. As a result of this well-founded paranoia, John becomes obsessed with hoarding information. He convinces himself that the only way he can stay safe and trust anybody is to know all their dreadful secrets. His fear of the unknown, which had previously paralyzed him, is now something that compels him to move forward, and helps us as the audience to see the full scope of this world.
The Taxonomy of Terror.
As the story progresses, John and the audience get to collect a nice variety of spooky stories. There's no common theme across them all, aside from the general tone of what the actual fuck just happened. Slowly but surely, however, John and the audience get to see how all of these seemingly isolated, random events are actually the machinations of something much larger.
There are entities in this world, beings of vast, dark power. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say they are next to the world rather than in it.
These things, these forces, they are our fear.
Yep, so there are these entities, and the mysteries around their existence serve as the crux of the entire metaplot of the Magnus Archives. These things are really difficult to discuss, although there are plenty of people who do try. These people dedicate their lives to studying the entities, including our architect pal, Robert Smirk. After a lifetime of observing these spooky folks, Smirk tried to come up with some names to stick on them. The terms he uses to catalog the fears are used most widely throughout the Magnus Archives, so they are what I will be using to discuss the fears as well. So let's really briefly go over them, as well as some of the ways that they manifest within the show. Some of them. They have a lot of ways that they manifest in the show. The buried. Claustrophobia, fear of feeling trapped, stuck, suffocated. Manifests as small, shrinking, impossible spaces. The dark. Fear of the unseen and unknown. Manifested as consuming fog and creeping darkness. The end. Fear of death, of cessation and finality. Manifested in dreams or knowledge of upcoming deaths. The corruption. Fear of disease, of rot, decay, filth. Manifested as a colony of parasitic worms. The flesh. Fear of mutilation and of being reduced to meat, objectified and rendered insignificant. Manifested by body horror. The desolation. Fear of pain and loss, of unthinking, cruel destruction. Manifested as fire. The hunt. Primal fear of becoming prey, or the fear of succumbing to one's base instincts. Manifested as animalistic monsters. The eye. Fear of being watched, followed, of having no privacy. Manifested by private information being taken coercively. The vast. Fear of heights, falling, and open space. Manifested in impossibly huge spaces and vertigo. The slaughter. Fear of violence for its own sake, often associated with war. Manifested in acts of random violence. The spiral. Fear of madness, of one's mind and senses being deceived. Manifested by distortions and impossible architecture. The web. Fear of being controlled, of your will not being your own, of being an unknown puppet to something unseen, manifested as a constant presence of spiders. The stranger. Fear of the uncanny, of things almost but not quite human, of unfamiliar things invading familiar places and making them strange, manifested as puppets, mannequins, clowns, doppelgangers. The lonely. Fear of being isolated, alone, manifested via disappearances. The first thing you may notice about these classifications is that they only really kind of work, right? Like, you could argue that there is a near infinite amount of fears, or you could go the other way and say that all fear is rooted in something singular, like the limits of our understanding. Even Smirk, the creator of the list, isn't totally sold on its precision, but admits it's as close as he can get to describing the denominations that he has observed. I personally really love this categorization. I think it's extremely thoughtful in its divisions, and I think it does some interesting things. To explain what I mean by that, I would like to first pose maybe an obvious question, but what purpose does taxonomy serve? That's a layered answer, right? But I think it starts off with this concept. It makes big things easier to deal with. It's a pretty well understood phenomenon, right? Names have power. Introduction of taxonomy draws lines between things, creates meanings from patterns, and decides which patterns are even worth noticing. Categorization makes things more distinct in this ways, and therefore easier to discuss. Within the Magnus Archives, I think one way to say what this taxonomy does would be to say that it makes the audience view the fears as something in between a zodiac sign and a Pokemon type. A zodiac sign in that it's specific to an individual even if they didn't choose it, and like a Pokemon type in that it can stack with other types, and that some of them seem to have strengths and weaknesses. This is a semi-helpful way to look at things, especially when we come to find out that every strange event that features in the podcast is part of this enormous game played between all the entities, as they duke it out to see which of them can reign supreme as highest terror over humanity. The war over the hierarchy of terror. External. Sadly, that Pokemon comparison from earlier can only take us so far, as the type matchups in Pokemon are pretty well balanced, whereas the type matchups in the Magnus Archives are way messier. There are a few sets of fears that are utterly incompatible together. Take, for instance, the relationship between the vast and the buried, or between the eye and the dark. These fears are somewhat mutually exclusive, so it makes sense that these entities would have this demonstrated animosity towards one another. Other entities often work together, and very well. The most prominent example of this is the way that the Lucas family, who serve the lonely, ironically, actively have business dealings with those who serve other entities. What's important to note is that these entities of fear have no wholesome need for friendship or camaraderie. Rather, this collaboration is largely a result of the power struggle between the fears. These alliances are largely, if not entirely, pragmatic and serve to maintain their positions within what I will call the external hierarchy of terror. Many of the entities seem pretty chill to let their peers do all the spooky work as long as they get to eat their fill as well. Arguably, the most relaxed of the entities is the End, likely by virtue of death being the most common, sort of inevitable fear. So, for instance, if a person encounters a manifestation of the Desolation and they are burnt half to death, that person is extremely likely to fear pain while also acquiring a newfound hyper-awareness of their own mortality. Thus, both the Desolation and the End get to consume their fear. Some of the fears are megalomaniacs, though. They try to amass power to jump up the hierarchy. This can be as a means of survival, as a fear is fading from the public consciousness, or simply as a means of asserting dominance over the other entities. They do this through amassing human followers and instilling in them an evangelical drive. Once these cults are established, their members actively attempt rituals, which are events that serve to offer feasts of fear to their patron deities, in hopes of these fears manifesting in more physical forms and kicking off a sort of fear apocalypse. There is a theory posited by Robert Smirk that all of these fears competition is potentially healthy, that maybe they can all function to keep one another from gaining too much power and having a fear monopoly. I wonder how that works out, in the podcast. Two kinds of people. Okay, so to address something that you might have noticed by now, the relationships that humans can have with these entities is really limited. Humans fall broadly into one of two categories: avatar and non-avatar. Non-avatars are essentially equivalent to livestock in their eyes. Some non-avatars are targeted by specific fears, some are tormented to death, but the vast majority of them feed the fears only passively when they experience fear organically in their lives. Avatars, on the other hand, are humans who have chosen to become earthly agents of their chosen entity, seeing it as their patron fear. The transformation from normal human to avatar is one that both John and the audience are highly concerned with. It is a process that we get to hear a few times, and the process seems more or less universal to whatever entity. They begin as normal humans, who, like most, would encounter some spirit-altering trauma at a relatively young age, and carry it with them. At certain points in these people's lives, however, they would have an encounter that causes them to recontextualize their relationship with that fear. They become fixated on it, possessed by racing thoughts, which ultimately drive them to explore the concept to its logical end, which is to say, killing themselves, metaphorically or otherwise, in the name of that fear. The entity, pleased by the dedication of this individual, sees fit to resurrect them and grant them certain powers, specific both to the entity and the individual. From this point forward, these people pursue situations where they feel they can strengthen their patron, and tend to gradually become more monstrous in demeanor, appearance, and ability. These avatars tend to flock towards others that hold their beliefs, and actively attempt to create new members whenever possible, in order to have the manpower required to follow the whims of their entities. Each cult is comprised of many avatar hopefuls, but few of them who face their deaths are able to make the cut and evolve into their next form. Like I said, Pokemon. But the existence of these avatars raises so many questions for the audience to consider. Can this happen to anyone, or only those who are selected? Did they choose their entity, or did it choose them? Is it inevitable for these marked people? These are the questions that the Magnus Archives sets out to explore. Although, oftentimes direct answers are really hard to come by in this podcast, Jonathan Sims, the author, has mentioned how choice is a really integral part of the process. And I think that we as the audience can infer that the process to becoming an avatar is one where someone decides what to do with their big feelings. The battle to decide the hierarchy of terror, internal. Of course, when I refer to big feelings, I am referring to the overwhelming sensations caused by the activation of the amygdala within the human brain, and the subsequent release of hormones like adrenaline. This is known as the fear response, although I would say it's worth noting that the process for generating excitement is physiologically very similar, often resulting in the same bodily affects like tense muscles, increased heart rate, and sweaty palms. When people think of the fear response, they also typically think fight or flight. These days, however, we tend to understand that our responses to fear can be a bit more complex. For this reason, I will be referring to psychologist Pete Walker's 4 Fs, which I'm going to really quickly enumerate for you. Fight is manifested as anger, protective violence. Flight is characterized by fleeing, hiding, and refusal to engage. These are what people are most commonly acquainted with. Then there is freeze, when uncertainty results in dissociation and stillness. And fawn, any response wherein you submit yourself for the service of others in hopes of avoiding danger or conflict. Now, these responses can manifest as an instant reaction in a moment of genuine physical danger, but they can also manifest much later in life as a conditioned response to any intolerable amount of distress in the brain. Now, I bring this up because I would argue that all non-avatars respond to the fear entities in the ways I described in the 4 Fs. Oftentimes in the Magnus Archives, certain characters' fear responses change as they become conditioned to dealing with the entities. It is often the case that a character's hatred of specific entities is directly related to which response they elicit in that character, by which I mean somebody who instinctively wants to fight is more likely in distress when they are forced to freeze in the face of danger, and vice versa. For instance, there are multiple police officers that are placed in situations where violence isn't the answer, and they have a really, really hard time coping with that fact. My point here is, the more unnaturally a fear causes someone to behave according to their own internal metrics, the more negatively that fear is ranked on what I will call their internal hierarchy of terror. Yes, just as there is an external battle for the fate of the world, there is also a battle of fears happening inside of each and every person, as we decide individually which of our anxieties to take seriously. At the bottom of our list is our biggest fear, that which repulses us the most. These are the things that are the easiest to externalize into demons. The middle of this list is full of the things that we consider dangerous but that are not actively threatening us. The upper top is that which we consider mostly benign. And at the very top, I'll get to that one in a bit. That one's a bit complicated. You can watch characters within the Magnus Archives actively sorting their fears, something entirely understandable within the text, as various entities take their turn attacking the archive. When Jane Prentice, Avatar of the Corruption, is sending her army of parasitic worms to turn everyone into a living hive, that is their most pressing concern. When Jared Hopworth is using his silent Hillikin to beat the shit out of everyone and steal their bones, that becomes everyone's most pressing concern. This is a very logical thing to say, right? We fear things the more we have cause to fear them, the more we are conditioned to think that these things can cause us harm. I'm sure you can think of plenty of real-world examples, and that they came to your mind the moment I started talking about conditioned fears. Here's the tricky thing, though. Every single individual person is under attack, literally or otherwise, by multiple fears a day. We cannot cope with feeling them all at once the same amount. This is where our brains take certain shortcuts, allowing us to forget some fears, if impermanently. We are able to convince ourselves that as this fear isn't quite as bad as the others, or at least not as immediately relevant, it's relatively safe. Once a person is on the pathway to becoming an avatar, however, I think it's safe to say that their relationship with fear, specifically their patron fear, changes. The shifting of perspectives is something that Jonathan Sims, the writer, deliberately takes pains to illustrate anytime an avatar has a chance to talk about their transformation. More than any of the wacky scenes of paranormal phenomena, this is a story that is shaped by the mental and emotional states of its characters. Upon examining the narrative arcs of all the avatars, there is a notable commonality. At a certain point, instead of being repulsed by a fear, an avatar is attracted to it. As I mentioned earlier, excitement and fear can feel very similar in the body. This is why fear can feel fun, thrilling, exhilarating. This is obviously pretty well known. Like, this is why the horror genre exists, and why we have theme parks to go bungee jump and ride roller coasters. So how do we decide to enjoy these bad feelings instead? Well, on the subject of gaining pleasure from fear, psychologist Christopher Dwyer says that there are 5 major factors that can make fear fun. 1. Safety. The belief that you are in no real danger, or that any risk you are taking is minimized enough to be tolerable. 2. Euphoria. The physical high that accompanies the adrenal response. 3. Self-satisfaction. The desire to push one's own boundaries, to test one's limits. Curiosity. Desire to see, to understand, find closure, even about dark things. 5. Closeness with others. Scary things can foster a sense of camaraderie, group protection. What's important to note about enjoyable fear is that everyone has their own personal limits, and their own reasons for finding things fun, although it's worth mentioning that predictability seems to be a key factor in the process. In broad terms, the easier something is to anticipate, the easier it can be to enjoy. Within the Magnus Archives, once a person is marked by an entity, they experience torment, both big and small, until they stop instinctively trying to repress or deny that fear. This leads them to eventually have a realization. This fear is, to them, something that is a fundamental truth about their existence, inevitable and inescapable. Now, a person who is set to remain a non-avatar would likely end their lives in fear, seeing this phobia as a demon. A person who is set to become an avatar, however, finds that inevitability reassuring, comforting. It shifts their perspective, and their world turns around a new axis, their entity, who raises them from the dead as a reward for their ideological breakthrough. Take, for instance, Jane Prentice. Her transformation from tormented human into avatar is the first that the audience gets to experience, in the form of her statement in episode 32, Hive. Her statement is in between a cry for help and a declaration of war, due to her conflicting mental state at the time.
There is a wasp's nest in my attic. It's what sings that I am beautiful, sings that I am a home, that I can be fully consumed by what loves me.
Now, while she may have been referring to a literal wasp's nest, I think it's entirely reasonable to infer that a wasp's nest in my attic is how she contextualizes her relationship with the corruption, which she calls the hive. The attic is her head, and this fear has been nesting and creeping into all her thoughts and behavior. This fear, trypophobia, was likely the result of her childhood bully saying that her blackheads were actual holes in her face, and that if she didn't keep them clean, they would rot her from the inside out. In her life story, you can really hear how she's internalized this idea of her own filthiness. She got a job selling healing crystals, only to cause an outburst because she couldn't shake the feeling that the store itself was riddled with ants. She is unable to genuinely connect with friends, and ends up being dumped by them for being too toxic to be around. Even more disturbing, however, is the fact that she goes on to defer to this fear, saying that she is less of a resident than the hive in her own home.
I do not know why the hive chose me, but it did. And I think that it always had. There is a wasp's nest in my attic. Perhaps it can soothe my itching soul.
In this final line, we are able to see why Jane is able to become an avatar, while others are not. For them, their fear never stopped being fear. Fawn's response may look similar to being genuinely enamored by that fear, but the entity clearly demands more than that. In this statement, Jane is showing how she no longer sees her fear as a torment, but rather as the solution to it. Avatars each have their own reasons for their attitude shift, and I plan to dig deeper into a lot of them much later. So, what's at the top of our internal hierarchy of terror? That fear which we have recontextualized. That fear which we find enjoyable, or natural, or calming, or foundational. that fear which we consider our God. Fear of the Lord, Part 1. I went to Catholic school. So, I don't know if all this says, I went to Catholic school for 10 years of my life, but I did do that. And although I've been not Catholic for a pretty long time now, it's really hard to shake the way that you're raised, right? It's really hard to shake that initial framework for viewing the world. Some things just really stick with you. Among the things that really stick with me from Catholicism, the way that I was taught about fear of the Lord was pretty interesting. This might be an extremely esoteric point, but bear with me. To set the scene, I'm in middle school in a theology class like any other day, listening to an explanation of why we need the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. Basically, there are all these gifts that the big fella up top gave us to help us get into his big cool house in the sky. You look at some of the gifts, it makes perfect sense. His cloud house is reputedly a place where only chill vibes are allowed, so it makes sense that you would want to foster wisdom, knowledge, counsel, understanding, and fortitude, and hell, if you're a fan of the upstairs man, you definitely love piety, but fear of the Lord. Even back then I was like this, so I raised my hand and asked if there was a reason it was phrased that way. This was the answer that I got. Oh, well, he would prefer that you do things out of love for him, but if it takes fear to live well, that works too. It doesn't matter if you're motivated by love of God or fear of hell. They're basically the same in his eyes. And as a kid who really drank the Kool-Aid for Catholicism, it really stuck with me, this idea. The idea that you don't have to love a god to serve it. That you could have this, dare I say, antagonistic relationship with them and still be counted among their followers as long as you do their bidding. I'd like to place an enormous pin in that idea and jump to a totally different quote.
Imagine you are an ant, and you have never before seen a human. Then, one day, into your colony, a huge fingernail is thrust, scraping and digging. You flee to another entrance, only to be confronted by a staring eye gazing at you. You climb to the top, trying to find escape, and above you can see the vast, dark shadow of a boot falling upon you. Would that ant be able to construct these things into the form of a single human being? Or would it believe itself to be under attack by 3 different, equally terrible, but very distinct assailants?
Now, I don't know if this is a universal association, but when I first heard this, I was reminded of something that I had heard many times in my life, but I couldn't quite place it. After some research, I realized that the message and wording were very similar to the parable of the blind men and the elephant. For those of you unfamiliar, this is a story wherein the titular blind men encounter the titular elephant and all pet the gentle giant. Some give pets on the trunk, some on the tail, some on the leg. Each of them felt a different kind of animal where they pat, and thus had very different ideas about the nature of the animal. It is then revealed that the elephant is a stand-in for God, or the universe, or truth. Fear of the Lord Part 2. We didn't all go to Catholic school. So, what is the point of all these parallels, right? Is it evidence that Rusty Quill thinks that all organized religions are actually dangerous cults? I mean, kind of, but no, I don't think that's it. I don't think it's a direct one-to-one. For one thing, the same character who says that quote that I just mentioned also says this right before it.
Oh, there are certainly those who see them as gods, but I don't find it helpful to think of them like that. I find simplifying them in such a way makes them hard to truly understand. The gods were conceived by humankind as a reflection of themselves. Their motives and actions divinely powerful, but in essence, purely human.
I wanted to sort of talk about the elephant in the room, include that blurb about myself as a sort of disclaimer. I refer to these big feelings as God, as that's how I was raised, and that's how my brain still contextualizes these big truths. But to say that the Magnus Archives is some sort of call-out to any specific religion would be completely missing the point. Yes, there is a character that is coded as the Antichrist, and yes, the Church of the Heavenly Host is absolutely a brand of Christian fundamentalist cult, but it would be very hard to label, say, for instance, Jared Hopworth a man of God. Jared Hopworth is an avatar of the flesh who gains the ability to modify organic matter after stealing a book called The Bone Turner. Nothing about his speech, his rhetoric, his behaviors, his methodologies reek to me of any sort of religious piety. He just steals bones and butchers people, and sometimes he's a personal trainer, but I can't deny that he's an avatar just as much as Agnes the Antichrist over there. He is able to embody and manifest his deity, his ideas of God, are still potent enough to manifest, even if he didn't perceive him in that way. To me personally, this showcases the evolution of what is sometimes called the God spot. Get your mind out of the gutter, because the God spot is supposedly inside the human brain. Although not any singular place, feelings of self-transcendence are sometimes associated with reduced electrical activity in the right parietal lobe, a structure located above the right ear. These feelings of self-transcendence can be caused by religious rituals, spiritual meditation, or the more secular types can also experience something similar on LSD-type drugs. I am not in any way trying to advocate drug usage. I am just saying that your secularism cannot necessarily protect you from these big feelings. It's speculated that these feelings are more or less universal, and posit that perhaps this is how all cultures, even before they intersected, each had their own ideas of God or gods. Furthermore, many have speculated that humans evolved to have a God spot to help them survive, that religion came about as a way to justify the patterns we perceive in the world, and also to soothe ourselves when we are feeling big feelings. The rise of science has brought with it some superficial comforts, for sure, and this is reflected in the decrease of membership in many organized religions. Despite this, it's interesting to me how the number of people who identify as purely atheistic is still relatively low. I suspect this is due to people like me. Actually, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say most people are like this, fueled by vague but powerful feelings. I would say, though, that not all of us recognize that we are full of these vague but powerful feelings, and as a result, we all do different things with them. For instance, I have encountered plenty of hardline ex-Christian atheists. You probably have too, let's be real. And these are the people who are really excited to debunk the mythology of other people's religions, who want to laugh at the fact that these silly idiots really think there's a big man in the sky. Now, I don't know if this is controversial to say, but to me, these aren't people who have really meaningfully left their religion, right? In my opinion, they're actually perpetuating some of the most rancid behavior perpetuated by modern-day Christians. They use humiliation as a way to feel self-aggrandized, and then go on to claim that this is for the benefit of evangelizing non-believers. The new God that they serve, or think they serve, is science, or logic. Fill in the blank, you know what I'm talking about. What's hard about these more secular deities is that some people can't even recognize that they're worshipping. That's right, I'm finally getting into the meat of my argument. Why the Magnus Archives is literary horror, actually. Jonathan Sims, shut your idiot mouth. A crucial message of the Magnus Archives is that for us to in any way deal with our big feelings, we must first be aware that we have them. If we are unaware of what truth we are spreading, we can cause irreparable harm without realizing it. On that note, it is time for me to talk a bit more about the arc of the Archivist. From here on, the heaviest of spoiler warnings. I've been talking kind of abstract, but I will be talking about the literal events in the order that they happen in the show. I will be talking up until episode 173, and that's most of the podcast, so you have been warned. The Arc of the Archivist, Part 2. Like I mentioned, for the duration of Season 2, John is a paranoid mess. Not helping this paranoia is the fact that, unbeknownst to him, his assistant Sasha has been murdered and replaced with a creature called the Not Sasha. In an attempt to banish the creature, John ends up only making it stronger, and nearly gets himself killed. Luckily, he is saved by an old man. This old man is Jürgen Leitner, and he's been living in the secret tunnels under the Magnus Institute for years. John is reasonably surprised by this turn of events, and demands answers from the former librarian. You see, many of the books in Jürgen Leitner's personal library were responsible for spooky things, so John had plenty of reason to suspect that Jürgen was responsible for, among other things, the death of former archivist Gertrude Robinson. John instead learns that these spooky books possessed power long before Leitner got his hands on them. The Norwegian man just wanted to be a reverse Pandora of sorts. It turned out that Leitner had been working alongside Gertrude to disrupt the many evil machinations of the entities. John also discovers, surprise surprise, the Magnus Institute itself is an agency in service of the Eye. This comes as a major shock to John, and he has to step outside for a cigarette in order to calm himself down. In the interim, his boss, Elias, beats Leitner to death with a pipe. John is then framed. John is then forced to live with his ex-girlfriend, while all his former friends suspect him of brutal pipe murder. Season 3, we learn about John's past. He gives a personal statement regarding how he came to believe in the supernatural and how he came to first know Jürgen Leitner's name. As a child, he happened across one of the spooky librarian's books, called A Guest for Mr. Spider. Little boy John stopped just short of finishing the book, and so he was spared the grim fate of being snatched away by the web, but his childhood bully was not so lucky. As a result, John, age 8, could do nothing but follow and watch as this boy suffered his gruesome demise. John's life on the run is primarily focused on figuring out the details of Gertrude's life and of her work in stopping rituals. To this end, he decides to read any and all statements that are mailed to him by Elias. This is how he first learns about the avatars, although he wouldn't have that vocab word for a little while. Here are his initial thoughts.
Maybe whoever sent this wants me to consider how many of these creatures used to be people, how many seem to have taken the mantle from the ones that came before them, and how none of them seem to be able to overcome their new natures. And most of them don't even seem to think like people anymore.
John realizes that when she died, Gertrude was attempting to prevent the stranger from performing a ritual called the Unknowing. This ritual would obliterate reality, so John is pretty invested in completing her work, although he has no idea how to go about doing that. His search for answers eventually lead him to travel abroad, and on his travels he encounters many of the avatars, most of which the audience had only known as background characters from various other statements. From John's reactions to them, we can assume that they are exactly as frightening as we've been led to believe. However, John is determined to get his answers, and this determination reveals something to him. He has the ability to compel truth from people by asking them questions. He pries the origin story right out of many avatars, and in return for the dreadful embarrassment of being interviewed by this sleepy-looking awful man, many avatars, they just beat the shit out of him. It's kind of great. This season he's burnt and dropped through space and cut and kidnapped and attacked and he's kidnapped kind of a lot this season, actually. It's kind of constantly. He is sort of always in a state of reveling at how awful these people are. These nasty monsters who lash out in rage with such great power. Like, how could these people still be people? How could they justify these temper tantrums? They also seem to delight in hurting John specifically, many of them having disdain for the eye. When John asks why the eye is despised, he gets answers like this one from Jude Perry.
Oh, please. Your God is nothing. The eye, beholding, ceaseless watcher, whatever you call it, that's all it does. It watches and knows, sitting bulbous and comfortable in the ignorance of infinite knowledge.
So, his ultimate assumption is that his entity is kind of lame, but compared to the others, it's basically benign. More than that, it seemed like the only place that could provide any relative sanctuary was the Institute, which, thank God, they keep sending him statements to read, as John finds himself feeling weak and ill whenever he goes too long without them. That's definitely kind of worrying, but his ability to compel answers from people is sort of the only thing keeping him alive right now, so he'll deal with that unease. Eventually, Elias admits that he, not John, was responsible for the murder of Gertrude and Jürgen Leitner, although he immediately blackmails everybody who knows this information so that they cannot report him to the police or remove him from power. While John makes a show of being unhappy with the situation, he ultimately agrees with Elias that his time is better served right now. After all, if John is going to stop the ritual of the unknowing, he is going to need to get stronger. From here on, John is very aware that he's being manipulated by the eye, but as he knows that and he hates it, he's still in control. Or at least he thinks so. John finally understands how to disrupt the ritual of the unknowing. Delightfully, it's the sort of thing that can be solved with dynamite going off at the right time. I mean, in actuality, it's spookier than that and more complicated, but long story short, it results in Jonathan Sims dying. Well, kind of. He ends up, as Elias puts it, all but brain dead, trapped in dreams given to him by the eye, and of all the people that he has interrogated, made relive their trauma. In this semi-alive state, John is visited by an avatar of the end, Oliver Banks, certified hot goth. He tells John his origin story. Once, Oliver's connection to death was merely in the form of prophetic dreams. He would see these enormous black veins creeping in and around people who were about to die. These visions gradually invaded his life until his sense of peace was so disturbed that he couldn't sleep anywhere. He was so desperate to escape these visions that he committed fraud in order to get onto a science expedition ship headed towards Point Nemo, the loneliest place on Earth. His reasoning was if he was physically removed from people, he wouldn't be forced to see death manifesting as these big roots, and therefore he'd be able to get some restful sleep. In the end, he still saw those tendrils and understood what was to happen. He and his crew were to die at Point Nemo. Knowing this, he steered the ship out into the middle of the ocean, where he and the crew met their fate, crushed to death by pieces of falling debris from a satellite. He had this to say on his fateful revelation.
Running was pointless. To try to escape from my task would only serve to fulfill another. I finally understood what I needed to do.
He then tells the unconscious John,
Right now, you have a choice. You've put it off a long time, but it's trapping you here. You're not quite human enough to die, but still too human to survive. You're balanced on an edge where the end can't touch you, but you can't escape him. I made a choice. We all made choices.
Following this, John wakes up. More than that, he wakes up and is fine. Shockingly, exceedingly fine. He makes a full recovery, and yes, he's more aware of things. He can basically smell statements now, which is good, I guess, as they're essentially his food. But at the end of the day, John, as the audience perceives him, isn't that much more monstrous than before, despite having been reborn as a proper avatar of the Eye. The most remarkable change to note is how he begins his statements, where he used to say, statement given by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London, he now simply says, statement given by Jonathan Sims, the archivist. But his personality, his humanity, that's a really tricky question. He's still very outwardly concerned for the state of the world, still worried for his friends at the Institute. He's worried particularly with all the changes that took place while he was in his 6-month coma. While he survived, his assistant Tim did not, nor did Daisy, this cop that I'll talk more about in her own video. Then there's the fact that Elias was actually successfully arrested for the brutal pipe murder. In the meantime, his replacement has been installed, one Mr. Peter Lucas, Avatar of the Lonely. Mr. Lucas has taken a liking to Martin and has begun to teach him the ways of his entity. Logically, Martin can't be forthcoming as to why he would choose to do such a thing, pursue this entity, so John is forced to pine after him for the duration of the season. Oh yeah, then there's the fact that Jared Hopworth attacked the Institute while John was asleep, Melanie has been infected by the slaughter, and turns out Daisy is actually still alive, but still trapped in the Buried. All this to say, John obviously can't waste time being worried about being an avatar himself. After all, he's got so much more to worry about, so much else to do. He'd been so concerned about being different with this rebirth, and that fear hadn't come true, so it probably isn't such a bad thing if he uses his new powers to help his friends. Their demons were so much scarier after all, so much more real. Maybe that's why John doesn't immediately worry when he starts sniffing the trauma on people and asking them prying questions in public, forcing them to relive their worst memories. He hungers for that dreadful knowledge, and now statements feel stale. He needs them fresh. When John is confronted with how nasty a habit this is, John agrees, but questions whether or not he can stop, wondering if maybe he's under the control of the web. These feelings are bigger than him, and he's seen how other avatars had turned out, how they've been consumed by their powers and driven to the brink. He checks in with the web, by which I mean he goes to their spooky house and finds a statement, and it turns out that, nope, he's not under their control. While he might be under new influences lately, all his choices have been his own. This news stuns him, makes him recontextualize some of his views of some other avatars, namely with an avatar named Helen. She was a person who had given a statement to the archive in Season 1, only to be consumed by the Spiral, who back then went by the name Michael, but Through her willpower, Helen managed to sort of climb to the top of the stack and become Michael. If that sounds confusing, that's kind of the point. But what you need to understand is that Helen never planned on becoming what she did. In spite of this, for the duration of her existence as an avatar of the Spiral, John is uneasy around her, and quick to voice his distrust of her intentions.
You're keeping her face then?
I am Helen.
Don't pretend to be people I knew.
I'm not pretending.
However, after realizing his own spooky capacities, he has to adjust these ideas. He confronts Helen and has a really sad conversation with her. It's not quite an apology, but it has some of that feeling, and although he's assertive in tone, it's hard to deny the fact that he's begging her for answers.
I've been thinking a lot about Jane. The first I actually encountered, like us. She seemed so inhuman.
And now?
I wonder how much of her was still in there. How much did she choose to be what she was? I assumed she'd been possessed completely against her will, but now I'm not even sure that's possible.
It is astounding the sort of thing you're willing to choose, given an unpleasant enough alternative, isn't it?
When does it stop? The guilt, misery. All the others I've met, they've been cold, cruel. They've enjoyed what they do. When does the eye make me monstrous?
Why would it ever do that? When has your guilt, or your sadness, or your hand-wringing ever actually stopped you from doing what it wants? You've sworn off other people's trauma for now, because you're caught. But other than that, when has your discomfort ever actually stopped you walking the path of the beholding?
I don't know.
Even if it were capable of doing so, what possible reason would the eye have to change how you feel, when it makes no difference to your actions?
Does that remind you of anything? Don't worry about it, we'll come back to it. So, as you may have gleaned from that statement, John did resolve to eat a sort of vegetarian diet, only reading paper statements whenever he gets weak. As Jude Perry put it, an avatar must feed their entities, or their entities will feed on them. Speaking of avatars, Peter Lucas has been trying to convince Martin that there's this new competitor entering the Battle of Terror. It's the apocalypse, and it's the end of everything forever. Mr. Lucas has been slowly revealing proof of this to Martin, convincing him that Martin alone can stop this new entity from being birthed and destroying the world. While this is happening, John is pining from him from a distance, by which I mean he's deeply worried, but, there are other rituals to worry about, like the one for the dark. Oh, never mind. It turns out that one failed a long time ago. It's whatever. John gets to eat a black hole, so it's, fine. Upon returning from this one, it turns out that Elias is out of prison, and Martin is missing, taken hostage inside the Lonely itself. John rescues him in an episode full of some of the most heartfelt moments of audio that I've ever listened to. John also murders Peter Lucas by beholding him, I think. It's a very powerful moment. After this event, John and Martin go into hiding in Scotland, and they exchange cute banter about cows, and they talk lovingly to each other, and it's great. John is then compelled to read a statement from Elias. The statement basically reads, "Congrats! You've now seen and been marked by every single entity. You, John, are an archive of terror." Boogity 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 boogity. The very fabric of reality is then torn asunder as John triggers what fans have called the eye-pocalypse. This turns the world into a series of horrifying vignettes, more than usual, with the earth being divided according to its inhabitants' worst nightmares. In this new world, there is no need for food or water or sleep. All you can do is feel fear. Welcome. Season 5. Martin and John are making their way across the horrorscape, facing every entity's new domain on their way to stop Elias at the new center of the world, the Panopticon. As it turns out, being the avatar that caused the apocalypse has given John a shit ton of power. He is able to see everything that the eye can see, which is a lot, and it turns out that he has the ability to unmake people as well, including avatars. He learns this by encountering Natasha in the domain of the stranger. She threatens Martin, and John knows suddenly that she can't hurt them. Not here, not in a world ruled by the eye. When John calls her bluff, she gets flustered and makes the mistake of antagonizing John over the fate of his friend, Sasha. This leads John to snapping.
"Ceaseless Watcher, turn your gaze upon this wretched thing."
No, please. Martin then gleefully announces that John didn't just destroy her, he smote her, and there's only one thing that can mean. It's time for a revenge quest. This is something John is kind of uncomfortable with. The fact that he destroyed the world and now he's able to walk around unharmed like some kind of tourist really rubs him the wrong way. But Martin goes out of his way to assure him that there's no real harm in hurting bad people, and moreover, it seems to be the only thing they can do anymore. Helen agrees. Yeah, she's just gonna sort of be there, following them from now on. Tells John there's no point in fighting his nature, just have fun with it. Despite this, John is unable to kill many of the avatars, like Oliver Banks, the avatar of the end that helps him wake up from his coma. Unlike many of the other avatars, Oliver never wanted to harm John, not really. So it was really hard for John to want to go out of his way to murder the man. This annoys the jealous Martin because I meant what I said when I said that he was a hot goth. Don't worry though, this minor annoyance is soon to make way for utter torment as the couple arrive at the next domain. Welcome, it's the Desolation. This place is an endlessly burning apartment building, and Avatar Jude Perry is somewhere inside. The episode dedicated to this domain is interesting. You see, Martin is not a big fan of fire. He's definitely been having a pretty shit time with the other Nightmare landscapes, but this one specifically really sucks. And he lets John know that, if at all possible, he'd love to avoid it. He assumes that, like every other place they've encountered, they're gonna have to suffer their way through in order to get through, but John informs him that this time they actually could go a less painful way. But John opts not to, because he really, really wants to kill Jude Perry. Again, John knowingly decides to drag his traumatized boyfriend into a burning building to get revenge on somebody that burnt his hand and embarrassed him. Martin straight up tells John that he will go with him, but he will hate it. And John confirms that yes, his fruitless revenge is more important to him than his boyfriend's comfort. This is a person that he recently referred to as his reason for being. How could they justify these temper tantrums? But John does find Jude Perry. He tells her how disgusted he is with her, all the pain she's causing. Jude makes him admit that it's not her that really disgusts John. He's disgusted with himself, because he enjoys all the pain that he's bearing witness to. John then reveals that he plans to murder Jude, and she changes her tone, quickly offering him help in destroying all those who have wronged him. When she is destroyed, the building continues to burn. The next domain is the Lonely, and explores Martin's past and emotional landscape, and believe me, I will circle back to that in another video. For our purposes right now, the next important interaction happens when they arrive at the Mortal Garden, the domain of the flesh. I don't want to get too gory, but suffice to say none of the plants are plants. They were just sort of sculpted that way by the gardener, Jared Hopworth. Everyone's favorite bodybuilder is shockingly really okay with the fact that John has come to obliterate him. He's seemingly at peace with knowing that he can't change the Archivist's mind, and has just one request. He wants to hear the Archivist make a statement about his garden. He wants to be seen and acknowledged for his work, however gruesome it may appear to outsiders. John is suspicious, but grants his wish, telling the audience all about the bone roses and the other spooky flowers in the garden. Upon the completion of this statement, Jared is happy, having received a little bit of validation. He asks John, were the things he's done really so bad? John panic murders him, although if his response to Jude Perry is anything to go on, I think it's safe to say that he could see the beauty in Jared's work as well. Next up is the domain of the web. Here, as a horrifying play is put on by enormous spiders, the audience is reminded of something. Addiction can serve as a vector of control, and thus in this world is hugely associated with the web. We are reminded of John's nicotine addiction, and of the spider print lighter that he once received in the mail. We are reminded of A Guest for Mr. Spider, and its lasting impact, as John's paranoia around being controlled resurfaces. It makes him suspicious of Martin's intentions, makes him want to violate his privacy and search his mind, to ensure that his boyfriend isn't under control of the web. At this point, I'd like to pause and address something that I'm sure you've noticed, given the context I gave the story before diving in. I think that to John, the web is his ultimate demon, the absolute bottom of his internal hierarchy, from which he flees with all his might. He may have chosen the eye repeatedly, as many characters, including John, will point out, but his compliance was pretty largely dependent on his deep-seated loathing for the web. He only took so much refuge in the eye because to him, knowledge was something that could and would protect him from deception, from manipulation. In episode 154, it's revealed that a person is able to quit and leave the Magnus Institute if they blind themselves. John's relationship with the Institute could have been terminated. His life could perhaps go back to normal, but he had to literally prevent himself from looking further into anything paranormal. And this is something he is unwilling to do. Instead, he opts to continue to watch, to bear witness to these events. His work at the archives doubtlessly makes him miserable, but in his mind, ignorance of the entities is tantamount to being complicit. To John, there would be nothing worse than to be an unknowing puppet. So he chose to be a knowing but unwilling agent of something that was, to him, the lesser of two evils. And, crucially, the lesser of two evils still ended up taking over the world. I think the nature of his choice is something that occurs to John as well, especially in the next domain. As they enter the domain of the dark, Martin is alarmed to hear children, a lot of kids, screaming in the darkness, and demands that John kill the avatar responsible for their terror. John then introduces him to the avatar, who is a 13-year-old named Callum, a boy who had been kidnapped by members of the Church of the Heavenly Host a year prior. This moment, to me, really cements something that the Magnus Archives has been reiterating since its inception. Nobody is born a monster. They're simply unlucky enough to be in situations where they feel that they have to become monstrous in order to survive or to overcome their fears. This emotional turbulence is something that seems to attract the attention of the entities, who seem to merely activate a latent ability of all humans in this world. To bring back that quote from Helen,
It is astounding the sort of thing you're willing to choose, given an unpleasant enough alternative, isn't it?
John's a fun little protagonist, isn't he? He's not dumb, but he's not really smart, right? He's this interesting pseudo-intellectual sort of guy. He takes himself really seriously, so it's definitely a lot of fun to listen to him get knocked down a few pegs, but listening to this man organize information and try to come to conclusions, it's really painful, right? Like, we basically hear the exact same information, the exact same order that he does, like, most of the time, and yet, we listen to this absurdly confident jackalope just leaping to these other conclusions. One of the first key moments to demonstrate this amazing stupidity happens in Season 2 with the incident with the Not Sasha.
in an attempt to banish the creature, John ends up only making it stronger and nearly gets himself killed.
And don't get me wrong, he's not like an intensely dislikable character. He's clearly very well-meaning, even if he's a blundering mess with a giant ego. I think my favorite characterization of John actually comes from a Q&A with the creators. Jonathan Sims, the writer, was asked to assign each of the characters a D&D class, and he described John as being somebody who believes themselves to be a cleric, but who is in actuality a warlock. And honestly, to me, this is such a great way to describe this tragic hero, like this brand of tragic hero. Like I said, he's not bad intentioned. Even when he's messing things up very badly, like initially when he's interviewing people, he does think he's helping them. Even if he doesn't believe in the actual supernatural events all the way in the beginning, he thinks he's helping them get their minds straight, find some closure about something that they misunderstood at the moment. He thinks that cataloging all these stories will at the very least help whoever takes his place in the future, save them the hassle of going through all this data gathering. But of course, all of his information is being collected, manipulated, and dispensed by Elias, so he never really had a shot of getting the right idea of things in the first place. Even in taking statements, John is perpetrating harm in some way. As we learn in Season 3, John's very presence is something that compels people to tell their stories. This is actually just a power of the Archivist in general. Their compelling presence. The way that we learn about this is actually super cute. When John is on the run, we listen to the assistants try to take stories from various people, and it's like pulling teeth. It turns out that if you were wondering why everyone who walks into the Magnus Institute is suddenly an amazing, writer with arcs complete and everything, this is not a bug, it is a feature. After giving these statements, however, witnesses do not feel better. More often than not, they relive that trauma in nightmares that recur every night. And surprise, John's gonna show up and watch you relive that trauma, and then he's gonna leave. That's just part of the deal now. All this knowledge extracting stuff is something that is a power of the archivist as a position, right? This means that Gertrude Robinson did also have these powers. And it is known that she did use them on occasion, but she never really took delight in doing so. Definitely not like John admits to taking delight in using his powers to compel answers from people. She, in general, took no pleasure working various gigs under various entities to stop rituals. She just saw them as necessary evil to stop bigger evil. Now, Gertrude is obviously an interesting figure for John. She's his role model in some ways. He obviously thinks that her legacy of stopping evil is important. But on the other hand, she was only so effective at this job because she was so ruthless in her pursuits. She had no hesitancy sacrificing the lives of others, even her own assistants, to do this job. And this is something that John is uncomfortable learning about. See, I think he wants to complete her mission while also making amends for her process. She went about things in a cold way, ended up throwing others into harm's way for her greater good, and in order to complete her mission while making amends, John seems to be intent on fixing evil by throwing himself into harm's way. But the more that John buys into his own narrative of himself as this enlightened individual saving humanity from their own fears, the more harm he carelessly brings about. He seemingly cannot help but rush into situations that he does not understand and make them worse. In season 4, this is something that Martin actually brings up to Basira. She's one of the cops I mentioned earlier. She's actually really cool despite being a simp for the other problematic cop. Without batting an eye, Basira responds that John acts that way because of his survivor's guilt. Martin doesn't understand, so she goes on to explain. You see, by this point, John has survived Tim, Sasha, in his mind Helen. Many of the people that he encounters in line of duty suffer, die, stop existing, and yet somehow he always makes it out of these dangerous situations. He doesn't feel like he has earned that right to survive, so he takes upon himself to bear witness to everything that they cannot, learn from all these horrors of the world, and make it better for the next generation. While doing this, he oftentimes keeps his headassery a secret from those he cares about and those who care about him. Here's the tragic truth that he discovers far, far too late. Gertrude's work meant nothing at all. You see, the reason that every previous ritual before Elias's failed is that each of them was trying to summon only one of the entities at a time. You see, all these entities are necessarily intertwined as they are all part of one giant being, right? So to bring in one entity without the rest is nonsensical. This is why that only Elias's ritual worked at the start of season 5. This was a ritual that factored in all 14 of the major powers, brought them all over simultaneously. So in the end, it didn't matter that Gertrude was blowing up ritual locations, or setting fire to others, or writing newspaper articles. The rituals were never going to work. All those lives she took for the greater good were entirely for nothing. Hey bud, you had this entire thing about being Catholic earlier. Can I ask what that was about? Yeah, that's, again, with the academic distance be damned, my experiences as a subjective person impact my relationship with media. So, despite all this nonsense, I gotta say, I really do feel real bad for Johnny Sims, the character. I'm just saying, some of us know what it's like to suddenly realize that you've been part of this big evil machination. Been like, oh, I'm doing good works. Oh no, just kidding. There's such a feeling of powerlessness to realize that you've been taken advantage of, that your ideals have been twisted and warped for the benefit of something that you do not agree with. There's this idea that in rejecting the symbols and the superficial of whatever cult, that you are rejecting all of it. It can feel like non-compliance, like, oh no, I've already walked away from that. But I think sometimes what happens is that you've just stopped actively identifying with that thing. Anyway, owning up to my own shit, when I first stopped identifying as Catholic when I was 14, I really did think, oh, I'm already done with all of it, right? Like, all of Christianity is just being like, I love this cross, dude. love all these symbols. Not so. Unfortunately, this is one of those really popular sort of groups where their ideology and their rhetoric has really just seeped into our society and into my actions. And you know, when I first left, I was one of those smug little assholes that I was talking about earlier, who, you know, I'm gonna come out and I'm gonna save people, and God, I was the exact same thing, just with a new paint job, but the exact same interior. Like, I really, really was so smug because I thought that I had left all that nonsense behind, right? And then I went out and I did the same thing, just the same but different. It's something I'm still working on, to be honest. Like, it's really insidious how you just take these things for granted. I still have to remind myself that thought crime isn't a thing. Like, I'll have an impulsive thought and be like, time to go to confession. Wait a minute. No, I don't want to get into, like, this isn't a video essay trying to convince people that Christianity/Catholicism is a cult. There's plenty of people who can do that way better than I can. But I do want to say that existing in it and then leaving this space felt like a cult to me. Like, this is my experience, right? So that's what I have the handhold on in my life. And it's weird, because obviously, like, at this point in my life, I'm 24, I feel very comfortable talking about it, laughing about it in a sort of dismissive way. But guys, my original plan was to be a nun. Like, that was my life plan. I was pretty active in the pro-life community, went to marches and lock-ins, and I was pretty actively homophobic. Like, it wasn't great. But I did these things because I wanted to save souls. It made sense to me. Like, that's so terrifying to the current me, isn't, like, the stuff that I did necessarily, but it's the fact that I really got into it. Like, I was so convinced. I was like, yeah, this makes perfect sense. I want to help people. And people who meet the current version of me are also confused. They're like, you want it to be a what? You did what now? And there's often questions about, like, oh, how did someone as smart as you get caught up in that? And it's like, it's not about smarts. In listening to the Magnus Archives, especially in hearing this specific part that I'm about to play for you, in listening to this specific part, one, I felt really seen and validated, and two, I was finally able to pinpoint something about this experience that was weird. For such a downer of a piece of media, I would say it's also, like, strangely compassionate. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but all of the different manifestations of fear and terror, these life-changing events that seem so impossible, no matter how silly or outlandishly they are portrayed or how different characters react, the story itself takes those fears seriously. It's one of those pieces of media that shows that you can hold evil characters accountable for their harmful actions while also not blaming other characters who succumb to things during moments of vulnerability. Like, you can have both of those things. The episode that really cemented this idea for me was episode 153, Love Bombing. The beginning of this statement is some of the most, like, thesis-y stuff that I've ever heard.
Everyone thinks they're too smart to get involved in a cult. I'm sure you do. You think that at the first mention of aliens, or the end of the world, or the lost book of the Bible, where Jesus buried his holy staff in the foothills of the Himalayas, you go running. Trouble is, that misunderstands how it works. I mean, when I was with the Divine Chain, some of the smartest people there were also the most committed. Intelligence doesn't make you less prone to taking on bad ideas, it just makes you better at defending them, to other people and to yourself. Smart people can believe some truly ridiculous things, and then deploy all the reason and logic at their disposal to justify them. Because belief doesn't begin in your mind. It begins in your feelings.
First of all, oh my god, the dissonance of listening to mid-denial Jonathan Sims, the Archivist, say those words is... So, yeah, we get it. This is essentially just a big old dissection of cults, and you feel like Christianity and Catholicism is a cult, so you relate because you're an ex-Catholic. But, like, the descent of this protag was, like, so predictable to an audience that can read the room, so why did it hit you so hard? Like, storytelling is full of pseudo-intellectual characters buying into their own bullshit and eventually falling from grace. So why did this podcast work so well enough for you to try to make a video essay to try to explain your big feelings about it? Dude, you were so chill before, now you've gotten just so aggressive. I don't think there's really a need for that. But remember the note that I had about constraint roughly 17 Gregorian years ago? There was a reason for it. Let me circle on back to that. So constraints in writing or in any creative medium, they're kind of like those weights in that iconic scene in Mulan, where people who don't really know the purpose of them can feel dragged down by them. They can feel like, oh, this is getting in the way of the story I want to tell. Like, I really hate that audio is only sound because my visuals will have to find somewhere else to live. But creators who really know what they're doing and how to do it can use them to get themselves up the pole faster. For instance, for the genre of cosmic horror, this is a really hard feeling to evoke visually. This is a known problem in trying to, say, adapt Lovecraftian ideas into gameplay. The moment that we are able to place rules, restrictions, visuals on something as enormous and incomprehensible as Cthulhu, it kind of loses all of its spooky power, right? Like, the entire point of cosmic horror is that it's so big that your mind can't comprehend it. On the other hand, audio is one of those things that really lends itself to this kind of horror. You can just have a person who is clearly shaken up, a trembling voice, sobbing, just trying their best to explain something, and they can't do it. There's a lot of information in that, and then, you can layer a little bit of music, a little bit of soundscaping, and it is way more powerful than the most detailed drawing of a tentacle face monster. I believe that. Like, that's a really excellent way to get around that. This is because brains, when given gaps in horror, they will fill in the scariest thing to them. Therefore, leaving more gaps in your cosmic horror is actually way more effective. Nobody knows how to scare me like I do. Another thing that contributes to the horror of this podcast is the slow, painful drip-drop release of information. I've done you guys the service of assembling the story into something that you can consume in one go, but believe me when I tell you that consuming this the first time is an entire ordeal. The dread, the suspense was the worst part of it, the worst part of everything. Because initially, right, you get really into the rhythm of listening to these individual statements and falling into the horror and falling out of it, and that's a very disorienting process, especially when you start noticing, oh, there's some recurring names here. But then you get to a point where the outer story, the meta story that involves the Archivist and all his colleagues, that starts to get more interesting. So when I was first listening, I would listen to the outside story, and then the statement I'd listen to on double speed, just to hurry up and get it over with so I could get to the freshest layer of trauma. Speaking of getting a bit too into the story, I do want to circle back a little bit further and talk about that favorite constraint I had, the fact that the tapes are diegetic. So it's worth mentioning that the initial explanation given for why the tapes are present, it only has so much mileage, right? We need to give a new explanation for the tape's presence as that one expires. So season 1, it's, I'm recording these statements as part of my job. Season 2, it's, I suspect that my life is turning into one long creepypasta, and I don't want to become a mystery, so I'll record my investigations. Season 3 is, okay, maybe talking to the recorder is kind of impulsive, and I don't question my instincts when I reach for it at this point. Season 4 and onward is, tape recorders are appearing out of thin air whenever something interesting is about to happen. Characters begin to realize what the tapes signify. It's the I, and he's feeding on their trauma. I'm sorry for that voice, I really am. It just burst out at me. This is my favorite part, right? Is that the characters all develop their own attitudes towards the tape recorders themselves. Basira, when she finds one, just kind of, stuff's about to get bad. John's like, dinner time. Martin's like, oh, did you want to eat some trauma? That's too bad, I'm gonna read you some mediocre poetry. The fact that our presence as the audience members is something that incites antagonism in the characters of the podcast, like, that's so wild and engaging to me. Like, they do not want to be perceived. They do not. We are seeing these characters at their lowest point. And boy, as a result, do I feel so much smarter than these guys. Whilst in my position of the passive observer, someone who's removed from the trauma, but also able to gobble it up. You know how John is really interesting, so compellingly stupid, but a compassionate character. You know how he thinks that his position as a voyeur will protect him from the very same evils that reign over his world? You know how he was wrong? See, the idea that I've really just been marinating in is the fact that we, as the audience, are similarly not safe by virtue of our voyeurism. We're like John, and John is like the endless witnesses whose statements he's collected. We're all born into, cultivated around, and driven by fear. We're all capable of becoming the things that scare us the most. So is there no hope? in the podcast. I don't know about real life, guys. Don't ask me about real life. After all, even if the podcast isn't over right now, like, their world ended. Like, they're in post-apocalyptic Earth. It's bad out here in season 5. Like, is there no hope? Well, strangely, I think there actually might be some hope for this story. Strangely, because this is, again, such an hourly nihilistic podcast. But I do think that there are many shimmers of optimism hidden in and around this sad, sad tale. For one thing, the way that the creators treat the rare moments of genuine human interaction, it's really genuine. Like, it's never played as frivolous or silly. It's always something that's worth it. In fact, there are many healthy-minded characters that sort of butt their head in and say, you know, if you guys communicated and worked well together and were open about your feelings, I think the entities would have a harder time separating and conquering all of you. And yes, while characters like John might throw themselves into dangerous situations to help those they care about, typically it's the method of helping that is criticized, and the brainlessness of those methods, and not the fact that they are going out of their way to help people. You know, as much as the various antagonists of the podcast try to convince John and the audience that human beings are just fear receptacles, I would argue that all of the most impactful moments occur when characters see each other as they truly are, and not merely as the product of their unfortunate circumstances. A moment that is, to me, particularly telling is when John is rescuing Martin from the lonely. This moment is a culmination of 4 seasons worth of mutual pining, and at this point, Martin has convinced himself that he is of no benefit to anybody, and this is fine because nobody has any use to him. In response,
Martin, look at me. Look at me and tell me what you see.
I see you, John. I see you.
Oh, Martin.
And Martin bursts into tears because he sees John. They're just seeing each other as they are. And this provides them both all the grounding they need to leave the lonely. But they were still exiled into the nightmare hellscape that John created. Oh, yeah, thank you for reminding me. But I do still think that there is still hope. Let me mention 2 characters that serve as a kind of a foil to John. I mentioned them briefly earlier, but I'm going to tell you their significance in the story now. Number 1 is Georgie Barker. This is John's badass ex-girlfriend. He stayed on her couch in season 3 when he was on the run from the police. She runs this podcast called What the Ghost. And even before she met John, she was a believer in the supernatural because while in college, she stumbled across a cadaver that did come back to life and whisper sweet nothings into her ear about the nature of death. This resulted in her losing her ability to feel fear, although she did maintain her ability to discern danger. So she's not like a reckless person. Later in her life, she met John, they dated, they broke up, they stayed cool. She obviously is a pretty steadfast friend. She was there to help him when he was on the run from the Institute. Although, when he takes his dirt nap and meets Oliver Banks, and then comes back from the dead with the help of a big spooky eyeball, this activates Georgie's sort of intuition, and she's like, nope, you're out of my life. This cannot be it. I'm sorry, as long as you've got that big spooky eye on your shoulder, you're out. I can't have this. The second character I want to bring up is Melanie King. She was the host of Ghost Hunt UK, which was this YouTube series that was quite popular. A lot of the ghost hunt community in this world, they're kind of lame because they only go to like pre-designated haunting locations. They're not really encouraged to look up new haunting because they're not verified. Melanie made the mistake of seeing a genuine supernatural event and then talking about it, which got her laughed out of the mainstream world. In trying to fix her reputation, Melanie goes hunting for war ghosts, and she finds them, and they do hurt her in many ways. This is how she met John, and one thing leading to another. She gets a job at the Magnus Institute and ends up being blackmailed to stay along with everyone else. She severely does not like being blackmailed by this shady organization. Like, no one's a big fan, but Melanie specifically takes to this news quite badly. Mostly, she deals with this in violent rage that she directs at John or at Elias. She's actually instrumental in getting Elias put behind bars, although, again, she wanted him dead, not imprisoned. midway through season 4, John suddenly knows that when she was hunting down those war ghosts, when they hurt her, they infected her with the slaughter. In response to this, John does some midnight surgery while she's asleep, and she wakes up and adds to his collection of scars. Later on, Melanie encounters John and is like, hey, listen, I hate that you did this. You've given me more trauma, but also thank you, because if you hadn't done that, we wouldn't have been talking right now. On the downside, though, my trauma is just trauma. Like, I was feeding into the slaughter because I'm a very angry person. Like, it couldn't have done that to me, couldn't have made me so violent if I hadn't given it consent. And the fact that you took that away from me without my consent is really fucking me up. Then she does some really interesting stuff. See, no one who works for the Magnus Institute, no one who has signed that magic contract is able to quit. But she decides that even if she can't leave, she's gonna stop doing her job. She doesn't care if there's any consequences, she just does not feel comfortable lending aid to some organization that she is convinced is evil. She then does the most revolutionary thing that any of these characters have done.
Therapy.
She goes to therapy. Like, she genuinely, like, she tries to get better. And then in episode 154, when John discovers that blinding herself allows you to quit the Institute, she takes up that opportunity immediately. I mention these two women because I think it's important to note that right before the apocalypse happens, they get together, like, romantically. And this is important to me for two reasons. Georgie is established to be a great judge of character. Like, that's why whenever John gets spooky, he's cast out of the house. That's her power, is she just has a super sharp intuition that is untouched by paranoia or anything like that. So the fact that Georgie is this excited to help somebody who needs it, someone who's actually trying to get better, I think that's very telling. Moreover, when John and Martin are exploring the apocalyptic hellscape in season 5, John, using his big eyeball powers, tries to look for Melanie and Georgie, and he can't find them. Which, to me, maybe this is the wrong feeling to feel, but to me, this is pretty optimistic. Maybe in refusing this paranoia, this fear, they have just been able to sidestep it, escape it. Maybe there is some way that hope can exist in this world after all. At this point in time, my conclusion is a bit unstable. The podcast has yet to end, you see, so I may be talking out of my ass in this moment. I might be. However, I'm pretty confident, just given the general arc of things up until this point. I really do feel that this piece of storytelling has layers and layers of emotional storytelling, and it's so refreshingly well considered and manages to be comfortingly formulaic while also significantly challenging its audience to recontextualize their own expectations. I don't know if it's obvious from the totally normal and organic way that I behave in front of a camera, but this is a new sort of thing for me to try, a video essay format. I had a great job doing it though, so hopefully you guys had a great time watching. Say hi! She's great. I plan to do more video essays talking about this podcast because it's really gotten my gears turning, as I'm sure you could tell from the length of this video. If you've enjoyed this, I hope you'll tune in for some other videos of mine as well. Thanks for tuning in.